You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Come on over to Odyssey Radio and see all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. You know what? The station itself, the network, has a show that fills every one of the 24/7 slots on the dial. So you're going to want to come over, check out what they broadcast, the different hosts that are on there, including the Situation Room with Rocky Stucci and me, and spend some time over there. You could have some good listening all day long. And, of course, during this show, you can come over and watch the simulcast, at least join the live chat room that's over there, occupied by all the other Intrepheads, the family that has grown up around this show, over at my YouTube channel, and that's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And if you don't have one already, go get yourself a cup of coffee, and you can put it in your Intrepid mug. So if you want to join our own mug club, so to speak, go on over and get yourself an Intrepid radio mug over at my Etsy page. And that's etsy.com/Mr. Oh, I'm sorry, back that up. I'm so used to saying Mr. Scotty Roberts for my YouTube channel. Go over to etsy.com/shop/Son of a Patriot. Son of a Patriot is my site over there where I put up all the different shirts that we design for both this show, Intrepid Radio, and the Situation Room, as well as shirts I've designed for many of the sub-series, the little series we've done along the way here over the last year. And if you're looking to see the archives of this show, if you go over, I'm going to look right now just to update myself. If you go over to Intrepid Radio, to my YouTube channel, Mr. Scotty Roberts, and look under the Intrepid Radio, all episodes, if you click on that, you're going to see that right now we have 193 videos that are uploaded from the last year over at my YouTube channel. So if you missed any episodes, go ahead and go over there, click on the Intrepid Radio link, and you're going to see all episodes. And you're going to see right now, as of yesterday's episode, we have 193 episodes up. And of course, over on my YouTube channel, you can see some of the shows I was doing that was not under Odyssey Radio prior to last August. And you can check out those videos as well. So there's a lot to see, a lot to listen to. You can put it on like I do. I like to listen to Joe Rogan. And I'll put on Joe Rogan's show while I'm doing artwork because it's video, but I don't have to watch it. Unless something funny happens or he shows something, I can look up and see it. But I listen all day long to Joe Rogan and other videos all around YouTube as I work, as I draw pictures, and as I design. So you can do the same thing. So thanks for being here tonight. We're going to kind of hit a final segment on King Solomon. And I had said last night would be the final, but I had to wrap it up really quick toward the end there to try to squeeze it in. And there's some things that I want to talk about in the fallout of David's reign and the beginning of Solomon's reign and how his reign lasted and what his reign was like. And so tonight, I want to kind of pick up a little bit where we left off on Bathsheba, Solomon's mom, and how she had a lot to do with Solomon becoming the king of Israel. And as we already noticed, Solomon probably was not the son of David, not the blood son of David. Now, you can look at the biblical text, and it will tell you that Solomon was David's son, and he had his own dynasty that followed, but the kingdom started to splinter after his reign. But the greatest achievement of Solomon was building the first temple in Jerusalem, and that was the highlight of his career. And of course, last week we read through the book of Ecclesiastes, which was a bit of Solomon's poetic memoir of his life and what his reign was like. Now, you notice Solomon never really talks about not being the son of David. That was his claim to the throne. But we never see him mention Uriah as being his father. How known was this quantity? We don't know. All we know is that the books of Samuel in the Old Testament present quite an apologetic on the life of David and also on the beginning of Solomon's reign. And this apologetic was put forward to, in a sense, give the reader in the future a different picture or an apologetic of what David was really like. Say you take a president like Donald Trump, and someone wrote an apologetic about him, a book about the man that glossed over his bad points and built up his high points. That is exactly what an apologetic did even in ancient times. And so David had quite an apologetic going. And Bathsheba, I think, we see her and we know her so well from the age-old story of the affair that David had with her. He saw her bathing on the roof, and he called her in and he had sex with her. And who knows how long this affair went, but she became pregnant according to the biblical story that we read. And so David calls her husband Uriah, which is one of the captains in his army, a loyal soldier, calls him back home with his troops for a little bit of leave and a little bit of soaking his feet, as the text says, which was really a euphemism for going home and getting some nookie, and to use some old words rather than vernacular crass words. And so Uriah, being the loyal soldier and loyal to his own men, he turned David down. And he didn't, not necessarily to his face, he just went back out with his troops, bivouacked with his troops that night outside the palace. And when David found this out, he called him back in. He says, "Why aren't you going and getting some at home?" And Uriah said, "I can't do this while my men can't do the same thing." And so he's a loyal soldier. So David, as we know by the story, writes a letter to his general Joab to put Uriah to the front of the lines and then back off from him so that he's killed. Well, Joab changes that up a little bit and says it'd be too obvious what you're doing, O king. And so I just withdrew from Uriah and the group of men he was fighting with. And they were all killed at the front of the line, in front of the wall of the city of Ammon, where they were attacking. And so David not only sacrifices Uriah, according to this story, but a bunch of his men. They didn't matter to David the king when he was getting what he wanted. This fits the pattern of David, who, as you know, in the Bible is referred to as the man after God's own heart, chasing God's heart, wanted to be right with God, the great sweet psalmist of Israel, the singer, and so on. All these things about David, they were probably true to a certain extent. David was a writer of poetry, a writer of music, a singer of songs. But did this epitomize his life? This is what we know of his life via the apologetic written about him. What kind of guy was he really? And we find that even God, in the text through the prophet, tells David, you can't build the temple because you have been a bloody man. You have shed much blood. You've been the warrior. You've united Israel under one kingdom. And so I don't want you building the temple because your hands are dirty, so to speak. I'm going to leave that to your offspring to do. This is the word that came to David through the prophet Nathan. And so we see this story of David that's shaped up. And we also see when Solomon, who we've been talking about for 2 weeks now, when it comes to his being anointed king in David's place, that David is well stricken in years, that David he's losing body heat, and they have to get a young woman to lay in the bed with him to keep him warm. That all of this stuff shows that David was in physical decline. You know what it's like when the elderly, you could be outside in 85-degree weather, and an older person might be wearing a sweater or even gloves sometimes because their circulation isn't working and they're always cold. This is the decline of the human body. So David had some of this going on. At the same time, it seems by the text and the subtext, reading in between the lines, that David was losing it a little mentally. And I don't mean that to sound nasty in the vernacular, but David was like a lot of older people that we know who they start to slip in their upper 70s and maybe into his 80s. And mentally slipping, and he's on his deathbed, so to speak. It's just kind of a death watch going on around David, waiting for him to die. And this is when, of course, Bathsheba goes in and reminds him of something he promised her, that her son would be king, which David didn't really promise, but he was of no state of mind to argue with her. And they went ahead and they had, it says, David in a very lucid moment says, here's what you need to do. You take Solomon down to the Gihon spring, have the witnesses there, crown him king, sound the trumpet, and declare him king. That all sounded very lucid for David at that time, which I think was probably something that was a bit glossed over. I think probably Bathsheba was working her machinations and her manipulations to make sure that her son takes the throne of Israel over the rightful son, Adonijah, who had a big party going on, as we saw in yesterday's show, and was celebrating the crowning himself of king, and yet Solomon is rushed to the Gihon spring and crowned king. He has the support of David. He has the support of his mother. He has the support of David's closest advisors, and of course David's personal army. We're all there to support him. So Adonijah, kind of out of luck. He waited a little too long. He partied instead of going forward with the business at hand. Now, Adonijah, at the same time, being the son of David, he wasn't, I think, usurping the throne for bad reasons. I think he saw his father in decline and said, I am the oldest son. I need to step up. It's time to crown me king. My dad is still on the throne, and until he passes, we'll be co-regents. And that's probably what was going on by the look of the text. But of course, once he heard that Solomon was already crowned king and the army supported him, Adonijah ran to the temple, well, the tabernacle. The temple didn't exist yet. And he threw himself at the foot of the altar and hung onto the horns. The altar was a big square device or altar with 4 horns off the ends, and he clung onto the horn, which was sanctuary. And for the time being, Solomon granted him sanctuary. And Solomon the young man became king. But how could Bathsheba, ostensibly just another one of David's many wives and concubines, garner enough support to put Uriah's son on the throne? And that's the way I'm going to refer to Solomon. I believe he was Uriah's son, not David's son. And it's critical to note where the support came from. Solomon gained the kingship because David's warriors were all behind him, David's private army. And they were behind him because Solomon was almost one of their own. We mentioned this yesterday. Listen to Bathsheba's lineage again. I just want to recap this as we go into what we're going to talk about today. Bathsheba's father, Eliam, was one of David's warriors. And so too her husband Uriah, and Solomon's father Uriah, was also one of David's warriors. Solomon didn't grow up in David's court as Adonijah did. He grew up amongst David's army. This was a military coup. David had always ruled on the strength of his private militia, the guys that came along with him. Some of these guys were the guys, if you remember when we talked about David, when David was on the run from King Saul and ran out into the wilderness and became a Robin Hood type of a character, it said he gathered to him all the men who were dispossessed, who owed debt, who owed taxes, who were outlaw. They all gathered themselves to David and became his private army of about 350 men. Now, this army stuck with David throughout the years. And I'm sure there were people that died and people that were added over the years, but David's army was this group of his personal men that stuck with him from the very beginning. And so Solomon didn't grow up in the court. He grew up in the military because of his mother and her family, her father, her former husband, who is now dead. This was a military coup, and David always ruled on the strength of these men that were around him and his private militia. And now that militia was claiming official command of the nation that it had, in effect, controlled for years. It was this army that won all the little kingdoms scattered across the hills of Israel and Judea and helped David unite them all. They conquered everything. They conquered with David the city of Jerusalem itself many years earlier. And so Bathsheba, as one of David's wives, perhaps had more authority or access to power than others who might have wished their military sons to rise to the top. But she also may have had extra motivation. Her grandfather, remember, and I mentioned this again yesterday, this is in recap, her grandfather, easy for me to say, Ahithophel, oh, for Pete's sake, Ahithophel, there's an A-H in there, Ahithophel, was David's former advisor. This was the grandfather of Bathsheba, and he turned his allegiance to Absalom. Remember David's former, his son who was killed in a rebellion, Absalom. Now Ahithophel, as may be expected, didn't survive the rebellion. The Bible says that when his advice was rejected in favor of Hushai's, he went home and hanged himself. And if he truly did commit suicide, it would be more logical for him to have done so only after Absalom had been killed, because he sided with Absalom. And even though Absalom was David's beloved son, he was still leading a coup against the king, and a violent coup at that. But it's equally possible that Ahithophel didn't commit suicide at all, but was killed by David as punishment for his defection, just as Amasa, one of his counselors, was killed before that. And it also seems likely that if Ahithophel had defected, his son Eliam probably had as well. Though it's not unheard of for fathers to fight against sons, it doesn't need to be the most obvious choice either. And then there's Uriah, Bathsheba's first husband, whom David had killed, and whom, based on Bathsheba's naming her son Solomon, she never stopped loving. When she named Solomon, which meant his replacement, she was speaking of her husband, Uriah. And it's possible that Bathsheba had lost 3 of her male relatives, including her father and her husband, to the sword of David. And so Solomon's kingship may have been Bathsheba's revenge. It was an opportunity to make right all of the wrongs that had befallen her family because of the king. And if this reconstruction via the apologetic that is written has any validity, it means that the fallout from Absalom's revolt was more widespread than it might have been imagined. And not only did Absalom permanently scar David's previously unblemished power, but ironically, in defeating Absalom, David may have laid the groundwork for the ultimate downfall of his own kingdom, his own kingship. The kingdom lasted through Solomon and several successors, and the end of his incipient dynasty. And so, with Solomon's accession to the throne, accession, not succession, David's power was finally and completely gone. And he was no longer the king. He was merely an old man that was confined to his bed. Now, we've done a lot of ripping on David, as we should if you look at history properly. But I want to read you something. This is the psalm. Now, this is also maybe a little part of the apologetic, but this is what David, remember when I said Nathan the prophet came to him after his affair with Bathsheba and after he killed Uriah, and they thought these things were pretty covered up, that David was confronted by the prophet and said, "You are the man. You're the one who's committed the wrongs." And it says that David wrote this psalm, and I think this is a beautiful psalm of repentance. Did David have a heart after God? Yeah, I think that he was a guy who was a warrior, a murderer, an adulterer. He was a typical Middle Eastern king in ancient times. But at the same time, I do believe that he was a man that sought after God's heart. Now, did he live his life that way? No. But he was one of those guys, and you know these kind of people, that profess one thing on the outside, they live totally differently, but when they're confronted, they have those moments. And David wrote this psalm, and it has this heading in the Psalms. It says, "For the director of music, a psalm of David, when the prophet Nathan came to him after David had committed adultery with Bathsheba." And it says this, and this is a highly emotional prayer, a song, a prayer of David to God. And he says, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love, according to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against you, and you only, have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. So you are right in your verdict and justified when you judge. Surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me, yet you desired faithfulness. Even in the womb you taught me wisdom in that secret place." And then there's this famous piece, and songs have been written, modern songs. He says, "Purge me or cleanse me with hyssop, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow," he says. "Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones you have crushed rejoice. Hide your face from my sin, and blot out all iniquity. Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me from your presence or take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and grant me a willing spirit to sustain me. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, so that sinners will turn back to you. Deliver me from the guilt of bloodshed, O God, you who are my God and my Savior. And my tongue will sing your righteousness. Open my lips, Lord, and my mouth will declare your praise. You do not delight in sacrifice, otherwise I'd bring it, and you don't take pleasure in burnt offerings. My sacrifice, O God, is a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart. You, God, will not despise. May it please you to prosper Zion, to build up the walls of Jerusalem. Then you will delight in the sacrifices of righteousness, in burnt offerings offered whole. then bulls will be offered on your altar. And those were the words of David in repentance. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Hang on for 2 minutes, folks. We'll be right back. All right, gang, welcome back. Thanks for hanging on through the break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my program, the Intrepid Radio Program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. Come on over to odysy1.com. See all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. At the same time, you can find this program over on my YouTube stream. If you haven't been there, go to youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts to watch the video simulcast of this show and to join the live chat room that's going on even just now as we're doing this show. So come on over and join us. I left off reading a Psalm of David, of his repentance. There's one thing I want to get across here, is that even people that seem to have the blackest of hearts, who commit the blackest of deeds, a guy like David, who was, think of a Middle Eastern monarch, as we understand some of them today, only put them back 3,000 years into the time of David, into antiquity, and you've got a very different kind of man than you would have today. And David was a warrior. He used the sword to consolidate his kingdom. He killed many people along the way. He took what he wanted. And in order to maintain and preserve his kingdom, he did an awful lot of killing. The apologetics will always put David in a place where, oh, he's not the responsible one. He was always away. He was always doing something. But David was the guy. And there is some truth even in the apologetic, thou art the man. And I think where we can say that David had a heart that was after God, a man after God's own heart, as the Bible states it, was because despite the fact that he was all these things, and sometimes of necessity, he was the king in very violent times, yet he was still a guy who, underneath it all, I think, had a belief in Jehovah, a belief in Yahweh, a belief in God, that this God was his salvation. And he always hailed back to him. But he didn't live his life by that. But he would hail back when he found himself in that position where he had drifted so far away. So for David to come to a bitter end is what we're going to look at here now. It was interesting that the prophet told him that because of his affair with Bathsheba and his murder of Uriah, that God wouldn't rip the kingdom from his hands, but that the sword would never depart from David's house, as the quote from the passage says, meaning the rest of his days, David's family fell to pieces. His sons rebelled. There was the story of one of his sons raping one of his daughters. But we think that's an apologetic that allowed David to actually have his son killed, which David was responsible for, but the apologetic says it was done by another. And so there's all this story of David. And now we see Solomon. This is how we'll wrap up our series on Solomon. It ends with David's death. Solomon's been proclaimed king. He's been crowned. Some of the advisors of David stand with him. David's personal army stands with him. Adonijah has to drop his claim. Cries for sanctuary from the altar at the tabernacle. And Solomon gives it to him. And then we have David's death. And this ends the previous chapter. And now Solomon's the king. The final chapter of the Bible story of David's life consists almost entirely of David's deathbed instructions to Solomon. And it begins with a short speech that, like the oracle in 2 Samuel 7, is a 7th or 6th century BCE addition to the narrative based on the book of Deuteronomy. So we don't know if David actually said this. It was added some 200 to 300 years after his death into the text. But David tells Solomon to be strong, exactly as Moses, in his deathbed speech, tells Joshua, like Moses told Joshua, be strong, Deuteronomy 31:6. He tells Solomon to keep the charge of Yahweh your God, which you find from Deuteronomy 11:1. To walk in God's ways and observe all of his laws, commandments, rules, and admonitions. That's Deuteronomy 26. These, David says, are recorded in the Torah of Moses, that is Deuteronomy, to which it should be noted David never really paid much attention to before his deathbed. Maybe he's a bit like Constantine, who was the first pope of the Roman Catholic Church, the Emperor of Rome, who lived a life of debauch, yet took the last rites and baptism on his deathbed. So all of this was in order that Solomon should succeed in whatever you'll undertake. That's Deuteronomy 29. Then David says, God will fulfill the promise he made about David, the promise of 2 Samuel 7, as Deuteronomy was written at least 300 years after David lived. It's safe to conclude that David never said any of this, unless you look to the writing. When I say 300 years later was when the Septuagint was written, when the Torah was written, the first 5 books, the Pentateuch, the stories of Moses. I believe those were written a long time before David, but rewritten after the Babylonian captivity, when they went to reconstruct the scriptures at the Library of Alexandria. So I believe it could have existed, and I believe David could have said these things. But it seems to be a 6th century edition, 7th century. Now, David turns to the specific instructions. First, he tells Solomon, kill General Joab. This is David's general his whole life. This is, to say the least, shocking. No one in all Israel, at least according to the biblical narrative, and probably in reality as well, was as loyal to David as Joab. David's rationale is baldly apologetic. Joab should die because he killed Abner and Amasa. And even in his last words, David's reputation is upheld. See, he's saying that Joab, my general, is the guy that committed these murders, when it's actually David that wanted this done. And Joab did that in loyalty to David. And so Solomon needs no fictional reason to kill Joab, for Joab had taken Adonijah's side, who was crowning himself king. And, of course, as we know, Solomon beat him to the punch. And so correctly perceiving that to be the course truest to David's legacy is why Joab went on the side of Adonijah, not expecting that Bathsheba was going to come and get her son Solomon crowned king. So the opposing general was never allowed to live, as the cases of Abner and Amasa, mentioned by David himself, prove. And so David also tells Solomon to deal with Shimei, the northerner who accused David of killing Saul's family. David had promised Shimei that he wouldn't die, which at that time was a measure of David's decreased power after Absalom's revolt. So Solomon can now do what David was unable to do at the time. And it's as much in Solomon's best interests to root out any potential troublemakers as it was in David's. And so in neither of these cases did David need to tell Solomon what to do. Solomon, if he were only half as wise as the Bible makes him out to be, would be sure to do them all on his own. This is what they did. Joab had to know this. These people had to know this. And like the speech lifted from Deuteronomy, it's certain that David didn't tell Solomon what to do. Solomon had stolen the crown from David's head. And there's and from Adonijah's, frankly. And there is no reason to think that he ever went to David for advice or for anything else. David was not Solomon's father, and I think everybody knew this. David himself. He was nothing to Solomon anymore when he was on his deathbed. And so these instructions exist to validate Solomon's actions as reprisals on David's behalf, rather than as the understandable decisions of a new king wanting to consolidate his power. And so with the final details out of the way, nothing was left for David to do but die. And in all likelihood, he died alone. No family was left to be at his bedside. Perhaps only a servant or two were assigned by Solomon to keep watch and report the happy news of his death. David had risen from the humblest of beginnings to become the mightiest king Israel had ever known. But he died without glory. His power, both physical and political, having long since slipped away. The death of David. Now, Solomon, from this point, can you imagine the death of this man and the breath of fresh air that's starting to be breathed into the kingdom again? Solomon is now on the throne. The army supports him. He's one of theirs. He's the son of one of their captains. And his mom is there, Bathsheba. And so once David was gone, all Solomon had to do was tie up the loose ends. He began as expected by dealing with Adonijah and his supporters. Remember Adonijah, who was going to declare himself king, ran to the altar and hung on to the horns of the altar for sanctuary after he hears that Solomon was crowned in its place. And in the Bible, Adonijah dies mostly of stupidity. He's said to have gone to Bathsheba, Solomon's mom, with a friendly request. Might he perchance take David's last concubine, Abishag, as his wife? Now, Abishag, who was she again? She was the young woman that they put into David's bed naked while he was on his deathbed and losing heat and to keep him warm. So Adonijah, there was something to this, the asking of a king's former wife or concubine. There was a political ploy there, especially in ancient times. So Solomon, when Bathsheba brings Adonijah's request to him, correctly interprets it. Why request Abishag the Shunammite for Adonijah, says Solomon. Request the kingship for him, in other words. That's 1 Kings 2:22. And for this gross misconduct, Solomon has Benaiah, his general, kill Adonijah. It's impossible to imagine that Adonijah, who'd been forced to seek sanctuary to save himself from Solomon, should now be so foolish as to try such a blatant attempt at a coup? I would ask, is it even smart to stick around Jerusalem? If you've just lost the kingship to your brother who wasn't actually the blood son of your dad, the dying king, what you going to do? I think I'd head to Egypt or somewhere else. Set up a little farm over there. Get the hell out of Dodge. But no, he sticks around because he was the king's son, his eldest son, should have been rightfully crowned before Solomon, and then he asks for marriage to one of David's concubines. And Solomon's like, idiot, no, you're done. And he has him killed. And so what happens there? Adonijah, who'd been forced to seek sanctuary to save himself from Solomon, is now completely playing the fool to try such a blatant attempt at a coup. This was a coup attempt, a mild coup attempt. Remember, if you had the wife of the king, that gave you power. It showed the king, Solomon would have inherited these wives, but this is what Adonijah was trying to do. And Adonijah was the rightful heir to the throne that Solomon had stolen. And so the biblical story, however, absolves Solomon of any vindictiveness. He had given Adonijah a chance to live out his days in peace. That's what the Bible tells us. He granted him the sanctuary. But it was Adonijah who brought around about his own death. Power hungry. And of course, he believed he was the rightful king. So he was starting in very small ways to attempt to build up his position again so he could take the throne from Solomon. So from Adonijah, Solomon turned to the priest Abiathar, and his life was spared, but he was confined to house arrest. His fellow Adonijah supporter, Joab the general, however, was less fortunate. David's general, his loyal general. After seeing what had happened to Adonijah, or equally likely even before then, Joab tried to seek sanctuary at the altar himself, just as Adonijah had. Solomon had been lenient with Adonijah, at least at first, but he wouldn't be so lenient with Joab, the general. He sent Benaiah, because remember, Joab sided with Adonijah. And he sent Benaiah to seize him from the altar and to kill him. And though this seems a violation of the principle of sanctuary, it was in fact in line with ancient Israelite custom. The altar provided no safety for those who were guilty of murder, according to Exodus 21:14. And even if disingenuously, Solomon was perfectly capable of laying the deaths of Abner, the former general before Joab, and Amasa at Joab's feet. Solomon could declare that he had rid Israel of its most dangerous man in Joab. And without mentioning that Joab was probably most dangerous to Solomon himself. And so finally, Solomon dealt with Shimei. Shimei was confined to a house in Jerusalem. This is the man who accused David of killing off Saul's family. And it was away from his home in Benjamin, where he might continue to stir up trouble, and given instructions that were nearly impossible to follow, he was not to leave his house, ever. And should he leave his house, he would die. Solomon only had to wait for him to step out into the sun and scratch his butt while drinking his morning coffee. And sure enough, eventually Shimei left in pursuit of some runaway slaves, and like Adonijah and Joab, Shimei died by the sword of Benaiah. So one group remains that had supported Adonijah, but never appears in the story again. Adonijah's younger brothers, the princes, the other sons of David, who were invited to Adonijah's feast. Remember, they were invited, but Solomon was not, because Solomon wasn't a son of David. So, and people knew it. So the precise makeup of this group is unclear. The Bible mentions two sons born after Adonijah in Hebron, Shephatiah and Ithraim, and 10 others were born in Jerusalem. David had a lot of kids. Remember, he had several wives. And it's hard to judge, because none's ever mentioned by name again. And it's hard to judge whether these lists are historically accurate, because these guys went off into obscurity after the reign of Solomon began. And it seems safe to say, however, that David had other sons after Adonijah. They appear not only here, but also in the story of Absalom's murder of Amnon, where David is afraid that Absalom has killed not only his elder son, but all the other princes as well. And so and that's back in the past. Amnon, the one who raped Tamar, his sister, his half-sister. So if David had other sons, what happened to them after Solomon became the king? There's probably not an innocent explanation at all for their disappearance. After Adonijah's death, the rightful heir to the throne of David would have been the eldest of Adonijah's younger brothers, and so on down the line. And David knew enough to eliminate all his predecessors' descendants to ensure the safety of his stolen crown. And it's reasonable to assume that Solomon knew it just as well. Think of it this way: if Solomon indeed offed these other brothers, they weren't his brothers. He wasn't raised in the house of David. He wasn't a son of David. So with these deaths, all the remaining ties to David's story were absolutely severed. Solomon could begin to rule without any entanglements inherited from his predecessor, David. Murder had been David's main path to power, if you remember his story. And with these final murders, that path finally came to an end. And with the last words of the chapter, the Bible formally transmitted from the story of David to the story of Solomon. Quote, 1 Kings 2:46, "The kingdom was secured in Solomon's hands." Now, the Bible presents Solomon's kingship as David's choice. David declared that Solomon would succeed him. David gave the command for Solomon's coronation. David gave Solomon instructions for securing the kingdom. But Solomon's kingship was not David's choice. It happened without his consent and even without his knowledge. Even though he gave instructions, I think that those were instructions that were put in. David was not mentally there at the time. So Solomon's kingship is presented as the divinely ordained continuation of David's dynasty. It had been predicted long before Solomon's birth. It was reaffirmed in David's own deathbed words, but Solomon's kingship was not a continuation of David's dynasty. Solomon, again, for the 100th time, was not David's son. He was the son of Uriah. Solomon had no right to the throne. He took it by force from Adonijah via his mom, who worked all the machinations behind the scenes. And her true heir, the true heir, Adonijah, was the man from whom the kingdom was rent. And not just David. David was out of the picture already. And so with the support of the army as well. So Solomon was a usurper. Really just like his father David, or his stepfather, if you will, David before him. So the biblical authors did all they could to hide this fact, though it must have been recognized by David and Solomon's contemporaries. But generations later, with king after king in Judah tracing his lineage back to David, the man who had created the kingdom of Judah in the first place, the biblical account won the day. The apologetic won the day. And it's prevailed for the past 3,000 years. And so the realization that Solomon was not David's son has an effect beyond mere historical curiosity. The entire myth of David's dynasty, built up over the centuries in ancient Israel, is based on a falsehood. There is no Davidic dynasty. The kingdom of Judah was ruled by a Solomonic dynasty, Uriah's son's dynasty. And the genealogies that trace the descent of Jesus back to David are equally problematic now. Jesus' line may go back to Solomon, but David is out of the picture, and so too are David's sons, whom Solomon probably had killed as part of his Davidic house cleaning. David's line died with David. And so the irony of Solomon's coup is that in the end, David's legacy is the same as Saul's. Both were the first kings, Saul over Israel, David over Judah, and then over the whole United Kingdom. Both must have had high hopes that their sons would succeed them and that a long-lasting dynasty would result, but neither would see his hopes realized. Saul and David were both outmaneuvered by an outsider, someone with no right to be king, who would come to wear the crown in their place. So let's look at the last couple of minutes we have, Solomon's reign. The Israelites who lived through David's and Solomon's reign witnessed a dramatic transformation on their land and culture. David had created two new kingdoms out of nothing. Kingdom of Judah, previously a region of independent communities, and the United Kingdom of Judah in Israel. The inhabitants of Judah may not have felt that they needed a king, but David imposed the kingship on them against their will. But once they had it, it was there to stay. David gave the Judahites a sense of nationhood, importance that they had never had previously. And long the minor area to the south of Israel's heartland, Judah could now see itself as an equal to its northern cousins. They had their own king once, with hopes of a lasting national identity, and David put that all to a quick end. And in some respects, the notion of the United Kingdom of Israel, Israel's golden age, is kind of a myth. Israel and Judah were separate polities, with separate histories, separate traditions. And in David, they had a common king, but not a common cause. And Judah didn't consider themselves Israelites in the larger sense. They were members of their tribes, their clans, and their families. And the reluctance of the north to see itself as a part of David's kingdom is evident from Shimei's curses, for which he eventually was put to death. From Sheba's rallying cry, and from the renewed separation of Israel and Judah that was yet to come. And the combination of the two kingdoms was an accomplishment of David's force and personal will. And it was really the kingdom of David, not the kingdom of Israel. And so there's a little bit more on Solomon here and how he consolidated his reign. And the thing he did, maybe we'll have to hit that tomorrow to give you a little more sense of why Solomon has become such a well-known and highly praised king in Israel's history. But for now, that's where we are tonight. We'll see where we go tomorrow. Thanks for being here. We'll see you again in 23 hours after this long break. Sit tight.